Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. We love to go deep on really fascinating books, and today we're tackling Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Yeah, this book is a classic for a reason. It's packed with insights into how our minds work and how we make decisions.
And I think what makes this book so compelling is that it's not just theoretical. It's full of practical takeaways that we can apply to our everyday lives.
Right. It's like a user manual for our brains.
Exactly. So let's dive right in. One of the core concepts in the book is the idea that we have two systems of thinking, System 1 and System 2. I've heard them described as like a cheetah and a sloth. Could you elaborate on that a little?
Sure. So system one, the cheetah, is all about speed and instinct. It's the
Yeah.
system that helps you, dodge a car if it swerves into your lane or just instantly know that 2 plus 2 equals 4.
It's like our autopilot, right?
Exactly. It operates automatically, quickly, effortlessly.
But I'm guessing there's a catch.
There is. While efficient system one is also prone to errors, especially when dealing with complex or unfamiliar situations.
Okay, so that's where System 2, the sloth, comes in.
Exactly. System two is our deliberate analytical system. It's the one that helps us solve complex equations, plan our finances, or weigh the pros and cons of a major life decision.
So System 2 is like the more rational, reliable system.
Hmm.
Why don't we just use it all the time then?
Well, because it requires effort, focus, concentration.
And our brains are kind of lazy.
Yeah, our brains are wired to conserve energy whenever possible.
That makes sense. So basically, when we're tired, stressed, or just overwhelmed, we're more likely to rely on System 1, even if it means making less than optimal choices.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these two systems is so important for making better decisions. By recognizing when our cheetahs is in the driver's seat, we can consciously engage our sloth to help us, steer clear of those potential pitfalls.
I like that analogy. So can you give us an example of how this might play out in a real-life situation?
Sure. Imagine you're scrolling through social media and you see an ad for a product you've been thinking about.
Happens all the time.
Your cheetah system one sees the shiny object and instantly wants it.
It's like, ooh, I need that.
Yeah, it triggers that emotional response and urges you to buy it now, before you miss out.
Fear of missing out, FOMO.
Yeah,
It's a powerful motivator.
it is. But if you pause for a moment and engage your sloth system too, you can start to ask yourself some critical questions. Like, do I really need this product, or is it a good value? Can I afford it right now?
Those are all really good questions that I know I often don't ask myself in those situations.
Right. Those are questions our cheetahs or probably wouldn't even consider.
So just being aware of these two systems and how they operate can already have a significant impact on our decision making.
Absolutely. It's like having a secret weapon in your arsenal, allowing you to outsmart your own cognitive biases and make choices that truly serve you.
It's like we're becoming the master of our own minds.
Exactly.
This is already giving me a lot to think about in terms of my own, decision-making process.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's more to it than just knowing about the cheetahs and the sloth.
Oh, there's much more. Kahneman dives into this fascinating world of heuristics and biases that influence our thinking in often predictable ways.
Okay, so heuristics are like what?
These are mental shortcuts our brains use to simplify complex information,
Makes sense.
but they can also lead us astray.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Can you give us a taste of what these heuristics and biases look like in action?
Sure, let's start with one that's very relatable, the law of small numbers.
Okay, what's that all about?
Well, it describes our tendency to draw sweeping conclusions based on limited evidence.
Oh, so like if you hear a story about someone who had a bad experience with a certain airline, and then you assume that all flights with that airline are going to be terrible.
Exactly. Your system one might instantly generalize that experience and conclude that all flights from that airline are going to be delayed or you're going to lose your luggage.
Even though that one anecdote is hardly representative of the airline as a whole.
Right. We often fall prey to this bias because our brains are wired to find patterns and make sense of the world. But sometimes we see patterns where none exist, especially when we're dealing with limited information.
So how do we avoid making these sweeping judgments based on just one or two stories?
By seeking out a wider range of information, instead of relying solely on your friend's bad experience, you might consult, consumer reports, read online reviews from a variety of sources, talk to people who have flown that airline recently.
So it's all about getting the full picture before jumping to conclusions.
That's precisely. Now let's move on to another common bias, anchoring.
Anchoring, what's that?
It refers to our tendency to be influenced by the first piece of information we receive, even if that information is completely arbitrary.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. Can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine you're negotiating the price of a used car. The seller starts by asking for $10,000.
Okay.
That initial price becomes an anchor in your mind, even if the car is only worth, say, $8,000.
So even if I know the car's overpriced, that initial anchor of $10,000 might make it harder for me to negotiate a lower price.
Exactly. You might end up offering $9,000 thinking you got a great deal when in reality you've still overpaid.
Wow, that's sneaky.
Hmm.
How do we avoid falling prey to anchoring then?
By doing our research beforehand, if you know the fair market value of the car before you even enter the negotiation, you're less likely to be swayed by the seller's initial anchor.
So knowledge is power in this case.
Exactly. Now let's talk about another bias that's particularly relevant in today's world: availability bias.
Availability bias. Okay, I'm all ears.
It describes our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled or vivid in our minds. For instance, if you just watched a news report about a shark attack, you might suddenly feel much more anxious about swimming in the ocean, even though statistically, shark attacks are incredibly rare.
Right, it's because those images are so vivid and scary.
Exactly. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of things that are easily accessible in our minds, whether because they are recent dramatic or emotionally charged.
So how do we avoid letting this availability bias, sway our judgments and decisions?
By seeking out data and statistics, instead of relying solely on gut feeling or, vivid anecdotes, take the time to research the actual probabilities involved. This can help us make more rational decisions based on facts rather than fear.
I think that's such an important point, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with, sensationalized news and information.
Now let's move on to another bias that can significantly impact our social interactions: representativeness.
Okay, representativeness. What's that one about?
It refers to our tendency to make judgments about people or situations based on how well they fit a particular stereotype or prototype.
So, like if I meet someone who's wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase, I might automatically assume they're a lawyer, even though there's no guarantee that's true.
Exactly. We often rely on mental shortcuts to categorize people and situations, but these shortcuts can lead us to make inaccurate or unfair judgments.
It's like judging a book by its cover.
Right, so how do we overcome this tendency to stereotype and make more objective assessments?
What's the antidote?
By consciously challenging our assumptions and seeking out more information. Instead of jumping to conclusions based on superficial cues, take the time to get to know individuals and consider their unique qualities and experiences.
It's about remembering that everyone is an individual, not just a representative of a particular group.
Precisely. Now let's talk about one final bias for this part of our deep dive: overconfidence.
Overconfidence. I think we all know someone who struggles with this one.
Yeah, it's a pervasive bias that affects us all to some degree.
To some degree, for sure.
It refers to our tendency to overestimate our abilities, knowledge, and the accuracy of our judgments.
So we might think we're a better driver than the average person, or that we can predict the stock market with greater accuracy than the experts.
Exactly. And while a healthy dose of confidence can be beneficial, overconfidence can lead to risky decisions and a failure to adequately prepare for potential challenges.
So how do we keep our confidence in check without becoming, overly cautious or risk-averse?
By seeking out feedback from others, being open to different perspectives, and acknowledging the limits of our own knowledge. It's also helpful to track our predictions and decisions over time to see how accurate we truly are.
It's like holding ourselves accountable.
Exactly. This can help us calibrate our confidence levels and make more realistic assessments of our abilities.
Last time we were talking about how our two thinking systems, the cheetah and the sloth, they work together to shape our decisions.
Yeah, and we started exploring some of those cognitive biases that can really trip us up if we're not careful, like the law of small numbers, anchoring availability bias, representativeness, and overconfidence.
Right, and I think what's so fascinating about these biases is that they often operate on a subconscious level.
Exactly. We're not even aware that they're influencing our thinking.
So today I'd love to dig a little deeper into some of those specific biases and see how we can become more aware of them and hopefully avoid those pitfalls in the future.
Sounds good. Let's start by revisiting overconfidence. I think that's a bias that really deserves a closer look.
Agreed.
Uh,
We touched on it last time, but I have a feeling there's a lot more to unpack there.
Kahneman talks about something called the illusion of validity.
The illusion of validity. Okay, that sounds intriguing. What is that exactly?
It's this tendency we have to overestimate the accuracy of our judgments and predictions, even when we have evidence to the contrary.
So it's like clinging to our beliefs even when the facts don't support them.
Exactly. It's like we get this false sense of confidence in our judgments, especially when we feel like we have a good understanding of the situation or when we've invested a lot of time and effort into forming an opinion.
It's like we've done our due diligence, so we must be right.
Right, but the problem is that our brains are really good at finding patterns and making connections, even when those connections don't actually exist.
So we might see a pattern where there is none, and then become overconfident in our interpretation of that pattern.
Exactly. And this can lead us to make some pretty bad decisions.
Can you give me an example of how this illusion of validity might play out in real life?
Sure. Let's say you're a hiring manager and you're interviewing candidates for a job.
Okay.
You meet this one candidate who just seems perfect on paper.
They've got the right qualifications, the right experience. They're a great communicator.
Right. They just seem like they're going to be a rock star in this role.
So you have this gut feeling that this is the right person for the job.
Exactly. And you might even start to overlook some red flags or warning signs because you're so convinced that you've found the perfect candidate.
So the illusion of validity can actually make us less objective in our assessments.
Absolutely. Because we're so sure of ourselves, we're less likely to question our own judgments or to consider alternative perspectives.
So how do we break free from this illusion and make more objective assessments?
Well, one key is to actively seek out dissenting opinions. Instead of surrounding ourselves with people who agree with us, let's make a conscious effort to expose ourselves to different perspectives.
It's about getting out of our echo chambers.
Exactly. This can help us challenge our assumptions and identify potential blind spots in our thinking.
It's like that saying, two heads are better than one.
Right. Sometimes we need that outside perspective to help us see things more clearly.
Now let's move on to another manifestation of overconfidence that I think a lot of us can relate to, the planning fallacy.
Well, the planning fallacy, that's a classic.
What is it exactly?
It's our tendency to underestimate the time, effort, and resources it will take to complete a task or project.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely guilty of this one.
We all are. We often set unrealistic deadlines or budgets only to find ourselves scrambling to catch up later on.
And then we end up feeling stressed and overwhelmed.
Exactly. We fall prey to the planning fallacy because we focus too much on the best case scenario and we fail to adequately account for potential setbacks or unexpected challenges.
Like we forget that life happens.
Right. It's like our optimism bias gets the better of us.
So how can we avoid falling into the trap of the planning fallacy? Any tips?
Well, one strategy is to pad our estimates. If we think a task will take a week, let's budget 2 weeks just to be safe.
In my case.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's a more effective technique called a pre-mortem.
A pre-mortem. I've never heard of that. What is it?
It's a mental exercise where you imagine that your project has failed and then work backward to identify all the potential reasons why.
So it's like conducting an autopsy before the project even dies.
Exactly. By forcing ourselves to think about those potential pitfalls and obstacles, we can develop more realistic plans and contingency plans to mitigate risks.
That's such a smart strategy. It's
Yeah.
all about anticipating problems before they arise.
Precisely. Now let's move on to another fascinating bias that can really distort our perception of the past, hindsight bias.
Hindsight bias? Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
It's that tendency we have to see past events as more predictable than they actually were.
It's like saying I knew it all along after something happens, even if we had no idea what was coming.
Exactly. And hindsight bias can make us feel overly confident in our ability to predict future events, which can lead to some poor decision-making.
Because we think we have this crystal ball.
Right. But the reality is that the future is always uncertain.
So how do we avoid falling prey to this hindsight bias? How do we stay humble?
Well, one strategy is to keep a journal of our predictions
Oh, that's a good idea.
and then revisit them later to see how accurate we were.
So it's about holding ourselves accountable for our predictions.
Exactly. And it prevents us from rewriting history in our minds.
It's like having a record of our past selves so we can learn from our mistakes.
Precisely. Now that we've explored some of the nuances of overconfidence, let's shift gears a little bit and delve into Kahneman's groundbreaking work on how we make decisions under conditions of uncertainty.
Okay, sounds good. I'm ready for a new challenge.
Excellent. Let's start with one of his most famous concepts, prospect theory.
Prospect theory. Okay, I've heard of that one, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. Prospect theory describes how we evaluate potential gains and losses, and it really challenges that traditional economic model of rational decision-making.
In what way? How is it different?
Well, traditional economics assumes that people make decisions based on maximizing their expected utility.
So we choose the option that offers the highest potential payoff.
Exactly. It sounds logical, but Kahneman's research showed that our decisions are often driven by emotions and psychological factors rather than just pure logic.
Ah, so we're not always as rational as we think we are.
Right. Our emotions can really cloud our judgment.
So how does prospect theory differ from that traditional economic model?
Well, one key difference is that prospect theory recognizes that we feel the pain of a loss more acutely than we feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
So like losing $100 feels worse than winning $100 feels good.
Exactly. It's this asymmetry in our perception of gains and losses that has a profound impact on our risk tolerance.
Because if we're more afraid of losing than we are eager to win, we're going to be more risk averse.
Precisely. And this leads to a phenomenon called loss aversion.
Loss aversion. That sounds pretty self-explanatory.
It is. It refers to our tendency to try and avoid losses at all costs, even if it means missing out on potential gains.
Can you give me an example of loss aversion in action?
Sure, imagine you're offered a gamble where you have a 50% chance of winning $200 and a 50% chance of losing $100. Now, logically, this gamble is in your favor. The potential gain outweighs the potential loss. However, most people would probably decline that gamble
Yeah, I think I would too.
because that fear of losing that $100 looms larger in our minds than the possibility of winning $200.
Makes sense. So loss aversion is basically like playing it safe.
Right. It makes us more likely to choose the sure thing, even if it's less favorable in the long run.
So how do we overcome this tendency to be overly cautious and maybe miss out on opportunities?
Well, one strategy is to reframe our thinking. Instead of focusing on what we might lose, let's try to focus on what we could gain by taking a calculated risk.
It's about shifting our perspective from fear to opportunity.
Exactly. Now let's talk about a related concept that builds on prospect theory, the endowment effect.
The endowment effect. Okay. I'm not familiar with that one. What is it?
It describes our tendency to overvalue things simply because we own them.
Oh, so like if I have a coffee mug that I got for free, I might suddenly think it's worth $20 just because it's mine.
Exactly. Ownership creates this sense of psychological attachment, and we're often reluctant to part with things even if we're offered a fair price.
That explains why I have so much trouble decluttering my closet.
Absolutely. The endowment effect makes us hold on to things longer than we should, even if they no longer serve us.
So how do we overcome this bias and make more rational decisions about our possessions? How do we let go?
One helpful technique is to ask ourselves, if I didn't already own this, would I buy it today?
That's a great question.
It forces us to detach ourselves from that emotional attachment we've formed to the item and really evaluate its true value.
It's like looking at it with fresh eyes. We've talked about a lot of really interesting concepts from Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground from those two systems of thinking to all those cognitive biases like loss aversion and the endowment effect.
It's really fascinating stuff, but I feel like there's still one more piece of the puzzle that we need to explore.
You're talking about the two selves.
Exactly. Kahneman talks about this idea of an experiencing self and a remembering self, and I'm curious to learn more about what that means and how it impacts our decision-making.
Okay, so the experiencing self is basically the one living in the present moment. It's the you that's feeling all those sensations and emotions and thoughts as they happen.
It's like the here and now me.
Yeah.
So what about the remembering self? What's that all about?
The remembering self is the one that looks back on past experiences and creates the narrative of our lives.
So it's the storyteller, the one that shapes our memories.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting. Kahneman argues that we often prioritize the remembering self over the experiencing self.
What do you mean by that?
We make choices based on how we think we'll remember an experience rather than how we actually feel during the experience itself.
Oh, so like if I'm planning a vacation, I might choose a destination based on how Instagrammable it is, even if it means, sacrificing some genuine enjoyment in the moment.
Exactly. You're thinking about the pictures you'll post and the stories you'll tell rather than focusing on how you'll actually feel while you're there.
It's like we're so busy trying to capture the perfect memory that we forget to actually experience the moment.
Right. And this tendency to prioritize the remembering self can lead to some really strange decisions. Like, we might choose a shorter, more intense pain over a longer, milder one, simply because we think we'll remember the shorter pain less vividly.
That seems kind of counterintuitive. Wouldn't we want to, minimize pain whenever possible?
Logically, yes. But our remembering self has a way of distorting our perception of past experiences. Kahneman calls this the peak end rule. We tend to judge an experience based on its most intense point and its ending, rather than, the overall sum of the experience. Huh.
Oh, that makes sense. So like a vacation with one amazing highlight and a great last day might be remembered more fondly than a vacation that was consistently pleasant, but lacked those peak moments.
Exactly. So the key takeaway here is that we need to be more mindful of this bias and try to savor the present moment. Don't just live for the highlights or the ending. Appreciate the entire journey.
It's like that saying, stop and smell the roses.
Right, exactly. So how do we bring these two selves into better balance then? How do we make sure we're not sacrificing present enjoyment for the sake of future memories?
What are some practical tips?
Well, one way is to practice mindfulness. Paying attention to our senses, our thoughts, our emotions in the present moment.
So putting down the phone, taking a deep breath,
Uh,
and really appreciating the beauty around us.
exactly. And when we're making decisions, we need to try to consider not just how we'll remember the experience, but also how we'll feel during the experience itself.
Both sides of the coin.
Right. Now, there's one more concept that Kahneman talks about that I think is really relevant here, the focusing illusion.
The focusing illusion. Okay, tell me more about that one.
The focusing illusion describes how we tend to overestimate the impact of a single aspect of life on our overall happiness.
So like if I get a new job with a higher salary, I might think it's going to solve all my problems and make me eternally happy.
Exactly. We fixate on that one change, that one achievement, and we overestimate its importance in the grand scheme of things.
But in reality, there's so many other factors that contribute to our happiness, right?
Uh-huh.
Our relationships, our health, our sense of purpose.
Exactly. And the focusing illusion can lead us to chase after things that ultimately don't bring us lasting fulfillment.
So it's like putting all our eggs in one basket.
Right. So how do we avoid this trap then?
How do we broaden our perspective?
It's about cultivating a more holistic view of happiness. Recognizing that it's not about achieving one specific goal, but about finding joy and meaning in all areas of life.
So it's about the journey, not the destination.
Exactly. And it's about appreciating the richness and complexity of our experiences, both the good and the bad.
Wow, this deep dive into thinking fast and slow has been a real eye-opener. It's given me so much to think about in terms of how I make decisions and how I view the world.
Me too. Kahneman's book is full of these powerful insights that can really help us understand ourselves better.
And hopefully make better choices.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this one thought. Keep in mind that your mind plays tricks on you. That's just the way it works. But by becoming aware of these cognitive biases and these mental shortcuts, we can start to make more conscious, more deliberate, and ultimately more fulfilling choices.
It's all about taking control of our thinking rather than letting our thinking control us.
Exactly. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of thinking fast and slow. We encourage you to pick up the book and explore these concepts further. We think you'll find it to be a truly rewarding experience.
And remember, keep those cheetahs and sloth brains in check.
And savor every moment of the journey.